If we really want, if we really intend, if we really as a society expect to stop police from abusing and killing civilians, which they do in disproportionate numbers to people who are black, brown, red, yellow, and poor and white, we must do the following actions. We must first treat abusive and homicidal conduct by police officers the same way other people are treated who engage in abusive and homicidal behavior. On July the 4th, 2016, Delron Small was shot to death by an off-duty police officer in Brooklyn, New York, who then falsely claimed that Small had punched him in a road rage confrontation. Surveillance uh, video footage proved that claim was untrue. The off-duty officer had not been arrested as of July the 13th, some 9 days later, had not been arrested and charged with killing Small. On July the 5th, 2016, Alton Sterling was shot to death in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, by an officer after having been tackled to the ground. Again, there was surveillance video footage of the shooting. The officer had not been arrested and charged with killing as of July 13, 8 days later, with killing Sterling. The prosecutor in the case recused, citing a long personal relationship with the parents of the officer who killed Sterling. On July the 6th, 2016, notice, these are all in July 2016, within days of each other. In July the 6th, 2016, Philando Castile was shot to death in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, by a police officer during a traffic stop. Castile was shot while seated in his vehicle and while obeying the officer's directive to produce his driver's license. Castile's fiancée posted graphic video footage of the officer pointing his weapon at the dying Castile as she demanded to know why Castile was shot. The officer had not been arrested and charged with Castile's killing even 7 days, a week later. On July 9th, 2016, again, all within days of each other, Alva Brazel was shot to death in Houston, Texas, in the middle of a traffic intersection. Officers claimed that he was killed because he pointed a gun at them. Surveillance video from a nearby convenience store appears to show that Brazel was holding his hands in the air above his head before he was shot. The officers who shot and killed Brazel had not been arrested and charged with killing him as of July 13, 2016, 4 days later. What's my point? Police officers should be subjected to and abide by the same standard of behavior applied to everyone else concerning conduct that is violent, vicious, and lethal. That has never been the case. Never. Police officers know it, people of color know it, judges and prosecutors know it, voters know it, pastors, rabbis, and other religious leaders know it. White people know this. If we want the abuse and the killing to stop, we must arrest, charge, try, convict, and punish abusive and killer cops and stop making excuses for them. White supremacy created this mess. White people must admit their cultural incompetence to correct it and accept leadership from culturally competent people who are black, brown, red, yellow, poor, and white. People licensed to use violent force have been permitted to trample the rights of poor, red, black, brown, yellow people throughout the history of this society, so white wealthy people could unjustly gain and hold on to power, privileges, and opportunities. When white settlers encroached on land occupied by the indigenous red and brown people in this land in violation of treaties, white people applauded and looked the other way. When slave holders raped and tortured and kidnapped and murdered Africans, white people applauded or looked the other way. White preachers and congregations applauded or looked the other way. White politicians, business leaders, civic leaders, and voters applauded or looked the other way. The police have always been able to count on white people to back the blue. After poor white, red, black, brown, yellow people have been brutalized and murdered. Beyond that, the police have been viewed by journalists and other media outlets as above reproach, even in the face of compelling video evidence that police have killed unarmed black and brown civilians without cause. White prosecutors, judges, other political leaders, preachers, and other religionists, and white voters have consistently rallied behind the police killers and not stood up for the black and brown victims. And white editorial writers have consistently not condemned police departments for the killing and required them to change. Until white people admit their complicity in and condemnation of abusive and homicidal practices by police and policies that enforce those practices, there is no reason for black, brown, red, yellow, and poor white people to treat their expressions of concern seriously. Stop blaming the victims and blame the victimizers, including the white supremacist mindset that glorifies the police because they protect white supremacy and privilege. Stop blaming hoodies, sagging pants, loud music, whether people have children while they're married or not, whether people come from single or two-parent families, for how people abuse and kill black, brown, poor, and white, and red and poor white people. Look in the mirror. White people must also admit their cultural incompetence to correct the mess they've designed and created, funded, staffed, promoted, and defended. People who do not understand the moral and ethical virtue of the term Black Lives Matter are not competent to lead a conversation about fixing the current mess, let alone oversee the processes and resources needed to make necessary changes to it. Culturally competent black, brown, red, yellow, and poor white people must lead the way ahead, not the usual suspects. Thirdly, abolish existing practices and processes that are associated with abusive and homicidal police practices. Immediately. Abolish them immediately. What are those? Let me tell you. Racial profiling must stop immediately. Stop and frisk police tactics must stop immediately. Forced encounters between police and civilians where police are allowed to stop and question and request to search anyone even without reasonable suspicion that the person has engaged in criminal behavior must stop immediately. Pretextual police stops, whereas the police fabricate a reason to stop someone, such as by claiming a traffic violation, must stop immediately. Use of force protocol that permit lethal force when officers fear for their safety absent some objective evidence of life-threatening behavior must be stopped immediately. People have a right to be left alone. They have a right to walk and run and drive and talk and gather, stand, play, work, live, and otherwise engage in legitimate behavior without being stopped and questioned and traumatized by other people who wear badges and carry lethal weapons and are part of a culture known for engaging in abusive and homicidal behavior with impunity. People have a right to put their hands in their pockets without being treated like they're murder suspects. People have a right to refuse to interact with police. People have a right to refuse to open their locked homes and cars and luggage and other property without being victimized, wrestled to the ground, mauled, and humiliated. And ending these practices can happen immediately. They can happen immediately. It doesn't require a lawsuit. It doesn't require an election. It doesn't require a town hall meeting. Police agency leaders and the public officials responsible for overseeing them can and they should announce that these practices are immediately ended and will no longer be tolerated. They can announce and they should announce that all current personnel will undergo retraining and cultural competence examination effective immediately. But we haven't done that. We haven't ended these practices because police leaders and the white power operators to whom they have sworn allegiance and whose interests they protect enjoy things the way they are. Cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural indifference, cultural precompetence are the way of existing political, social, civic, and policing leaders are why they are the way they are and why we have not abolished the processes and practices responsible for our current situation and current atmosphere of violence and distrust. Fourthly, established, fund, and support independent and aggressive review protocol concerning abusive and homicidal policing allegations. People have good reason to distrust police and prosecutors to conscientiously investigate and charge and prosecute police officers who are suspected of having committed abusive or homicidal conduct. Think of it. We don't allow teammates to referee sporting events for their teams. Likewise, we shouldn't allow police to be impartial investigators, and we shouldn't expect police to be impartial investigators of suspicious behavior by their co-workers that maims or kills others. And we should not expect prosecutors who routinely work with police in a given jurisdiction to be objective and fair-minded to investigate and aggressively prosecute allegations of abusive and homicidal police conduct. What we should have is an independent agency responsible for investigating, reporting, and prosecuting allegations of abusive and homicidal police conduct, and we should create that agency. We should fund it, staff it, and support it in every locality and state. That agency should be fully independent from political partisanship and fully commissioned to investigate and prosecute suspicious police practices that result in abuse and death on its own volition, not at the belated or the begrudging invitation of defensive police agency leaders and politicians. The agency should be staffed with crime scene investigators, subpoena and prosecutors, and other technical personnel. The agency should be authorized to subpoena records and conduct interviews and lodge criminal charges against police suspected of abusive and homicidal police conduct. Next, judges must stop shielding abusive and homicidal police behavior. Judges determine whether conduct is deemed reasonable or legally unacceptable. Court decisions now allow police to use lethal force based on fear of officer safety, without objective evidence that a police officer is confronting someone who presents a real and present lethal threat. These decisions exist only because judges are more likely to be police sympathizers than civil libertarians. Civilians are not deemed justified in killing others based on fearfulness without proof that they have actually been threatened with lethal force. Being scared of others because they are physically, ethnically, politically, socially, occupationally, nationally, religiously, or otherwise different is no reason to attack and kill them. That standard should apply to police officers just like it applies to civilians. It is either reasonable for everyone, including the police, or it's reasonable for no one. This means that voters and other judicial selection bodies must exercise care when electing judges. Judges are elected in 39 states, and selecting governors and judicial selection commissions. when we select judges through those processes. It's not enough for a candidate to promise to be fair and tough on crime. If the candidate has not previously demonstrated cultural competence and commitment to fairness concerning the plight of marginalized communities, then voters and judicial ethics and judicial selection bodies should not elect or select that candidate for judicial office. As Justice Hugo Black wrote in a 1940 opinion in Chambers versus Florida while on the U.S. Supreme Court, quote, courts stand as havens of refuge for those who might otherwise suffer because they are helpless, weak, outnumbered, or non-conforming victims of prejudice and public excitement. People selected or elected as judges must possess cultural competence, must possess courage, and must possess integrity to do this work. Finally, let me say the current system can be fixed. It can be fixed. Our current predicament is not like the weather. It's not beyond human control. Humans created it. We can abolish the dysfunctional system we created and replace it, but we will not do that until we stop defending and trying to prop up or patch our current policies, procedures, and practices and the people who operate them. We must admit the reality of white supremacy and its oppressive force. We must replace what we have with culturally competent people, processes, policies, and practices. We must hold abusive and homicidal police actors accountable. We must establish, fund, staff, and support fully independent review agencies to investigate, charge, and prosecute abusive and homicidal police actions. We must elect and select culturally competent prosecutors and judges. Each of these things can be done. We can begin doing them immediately. The only thing stopping us is our unwilling to be changed, our unwillingness to change, and truly our unwillingness to become a just society. Time will tell whether politicians and preachers, business owners and workers, students and senior citizens, white people and people of color, police leaders and people from communities of color will embrace this plan of action. We will not do it until we start, and there's no better time to start than now. My name is Wendell Griffen in Little Rock, Arkansas. Let's do it.